Hey guys, here is a video about the U.S. government. And so for the social studies test, it's really good to have a good basic knowledge of how the U.S. government is set up and how it works and like what different jobs they do based on the different part of the U.S. government. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So there are three branches of the government. There is the executive branch, there's the legislative branch, and there's the judicial branch. And so these branches, we see this on a national scale, like up in Washington, D.C., but we even see this at a state and a local level as well. So the executive branch is made up of the president and the vice president and the presidential cabinet. And so at a state level, it's made up of like the governor and things like that, but today we're mostly going to focus on a national level. So what the executive branch does is that they carry out the laws. So somebody else makes the laws, and it's the job of the executive branch to help carry out the laws. And what that means is that it has a lot of different departments that help enforce the laws. So once Congress writes a law and makes something the law of the land, it's up to the executive branch and all the different cabinets to do what needs to be done to make sure those laws can be put in place. So for instance, the Labor Department is a cabinet under the president. And so if there are new laws that are put into place about workers, it's the Labor Department's job to help enforce those, to help execute those laws. So they make sure that places of employment know these laws, that they have what they need to put them into practice, that the workers have what they need, that kind of thing. It's similar to the Interior Department, for instance. So the Interior Department, that falls under the presidential cabinet as well. What they do is that they help carry out laws dealing with natural resources. So if Congress makes it a law you can't drill for oil on certain land, the Interior Department, with the help of the president, they will help states and help the country carry out those laws about, hey, you're not supposed to drill here, so they will maybe put people there in jobs to make sure that drilling doesn't go on, give them signage, fences, protection, that kind of thing, to enforce that law. So that's what the executive branch does. Now, the legislative branch is basically Congress in the United States. And the Congress is made up of two separate houses. It's called a bicameral legislature. And all that means is that it's made up of two different parts. So our Congress is made up of the House of Representatives, and it is made up of the Senate. So in the Senate, we have 100 senators. So no matter what, we have 100 senators. Each state has 2 senators. So we get 2 senators each for a state. Now, the House of Representatives, they determine how many representatives your state gets based off the population. So really big states have many more representatives than smaller states do. So for instance, really small states, like population-wise, like Montana, Rhode Island, they only have 1 representative. Bigger states like California, they have 53. A state like us in Kentucky, we only have 6 representatives because we're not that big of a state. So they decide how many representatives a state gets based on how many people live there. And so what Congress does is that they make the laws, they write the laws. And so they write and propose laws, which are called bills. So if it hasn't been made a law yet, if they're just knocking around the idea, they've written it up like, hey, we think this should be a law, here's a rough draft of it, basically, that is called a bill. And so they propose these bills that may become laws if it can jump through the hoops that it's supposed to become a law. And then lastly is the judicial branch. So just like the name tells us, judicial deals with judges. And so at a national level, that is the Supreme Court. And so on the Supreme Court, there are 9 Supreme Court justices that are appointed by the president. And when somebody becomes a Supreme Court justice, they are in the Supreme Court for life, unless they choose to retire. So for instance, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg just passed away this year, and they replaced her with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was there until she passed away, and then they had to come up with somebody to replace her. And so what the judicial branch does is it interprets the laws. It decides what the laws mean, what the Constitution means. So, for instance, maybe a state proposes a law, but there's a question, whether that can be a law, whether that's constitutional or not, whether that's allowed. And so what the judicial branch does is they decide if those laws are allowed, if those are constitutional. Let's say that somebody in Kentucky tried to make it a law that you have to eat 20 red gummy bears every Tuesday. That's the law. You have to eat 20 red gummy bears every Tuesday. So that is a ridiculous law. So somebody would probably challenge that and say, hey, that's a really silly law. And it would go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it would be up to the Supreme Court to say, hey, that's not constitutional. We can't control what you eat on what day. That's dumb. That can't be a law. So, and that happens sometimes. So people challenge laws. They say, hey, that's not right, that's not fair, that's not constitutional. And it'll go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides whether that can be a law or not, or whether it can continue to be a law. And so the thing about having these three branches of government is that when the Founding Fathers designed the government, they didn't want anybody to be too powerful. We had just come from a country with a king who was on a really big power trip, who wanted to tell everybody what they could do, and we didn't want to deal with that anymore. So what they did when they established the government, they came up with checks and balances. And so basically what that means is that one branch of the government can't be more powerful than the other. Congress can't be more powerful than the president. The president can't be more powerful than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can't be more powerful than Congress. So on and on, you guys get it. And so what happens is that each branch of the government has powers or jobs that can check the power of the other branches. It's like, okay, you're allowed to do that, but I'm allowed to do this to limit your power so you don't go crazy with power. So, for instance, the President of the United States, the executive branch, he or she can appoint Supreme Court judges. That is part of their job. And so they decide who can be on the Supreme Court, and it's for life. So, for instance, like I said earlier, we had a Supreme Court justice pass away. So President Trump decided to appoint a Supreme Court justice. So that is a power under the president. But the way that the legislative branch can check that power is that they have to approve those judges. So you can appoint somebody, but it can't go through until Congress approves it. And so the judicial branch, they decide whether things that Congress and whether things that the president do are constitutional, but it is the president that nominates those people, and it's the legislative branch that confirms them, that approves of them. So even though one might have power over the other one, they can still check that power. For instance, Congress or the legislative branch, they make the laws. They decide, hey, I want this to be a law. But the president can veto those laws. The president can say, I don't want that to be a law, I veto it. But then Congress can override that veto if they have enough votes. And so Congress can override that, but the judicial branch has the power to say whether that law is constitutional or not. Like, hey, that's allowed to be a law, or that isn't allowed to be a law. It's an overreach, like you're overstepping your power, or yeah, you can do that. So they have these things that they do to make sure the other branches of government don't become too powerful. So now I just want to practice categorizing. So categorizing is a skill you need for the social studies test, also science and language arts as well. But what we're going to do, we are going to categorize these jobs over here on the right with what branch of government they fall under. So there's legislative, executive, and judicial. So what branch of government does the Senate fall under? The Senate goes with the legislative branch. What about the president? The president goes with the executive branch. What about the federal courts? So that deals with the judicial branch. The House of Representatives is the other part of Congress, so that's the legislative. What about the cabinet? The cabinet is part of the executive branch, so that's the president's cabinet, the president's advisors. And then the Supreme Court goes under the judicial branch, as well as the appellate court, so like the appeals court. So this is just an example of something you might see on the social studies test. You have to categorize which branch of the government these go under. So all categorizing means is, hey, you put these things into groups. Okay, here is an example of sequencing. So in this, we have to put the steps in order of how a bill becomes a law. And so there's 12 steps, but here we're just dealing with the first 6. So we have the bill is sent to committee, the bill is proposed, the idea to a written bill, the bill is given a number, or the bill is introduced. So which of these do you think happens first? Yeah, well, first of all, the idea to a written bill. So somebody has to come up with the idea first. It's like, hey, this is our idea. This is what we want to happen. Then what do you think happens after they come up with this idea? After they write this bill? So after they write this bill, the bill is going to be proposed. So it's proposed, they send it to the people who need to see it. The representative that writes the bill must get a sponsor. The representative must go and gather support from other representatives to sponsor and support the bill before it's introduced on the House floor. So you have to get people to back it before you can even bring it up to everybody else. And then what do you think happens after it is proposed? The bill is introduced. So in the House of Representatives, you have to place a bill on the hopper. So it's this box on the clerk's desk. So you have to come up with an idea, you have to write it, you have to propose it, and then you have to introduce it to everybody in the House of Representatives. And so after you introduce this bill, what happens is they give it a number. So if you ever watch C-SPAN, I don't know if you would willingly, it's pretty boring, but sometimes you get to watch them debate bills, and they'll say, we are here about Bill H.R. 5616, blah, 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 and then they give it a number so that they can keep track of it. And so after this bill is given a number, they have to read it, and then it's going to be sent to a committee. So they're obviously not going to send it to a committee before they have read it. At least I hope they wouldn't. And so a clerk reads this bill to all of the representatives. And so after all the representatives have heard about the bill, they send it to one of the House standing committees. And so committees are just like smaller parts, smaller groups of the House of Representatives, basically. And so they read over the bill, they research it, they fix it, they revise it if there's anything that they think needs to be fixed. If there is, they send it back. Or if it's good, then they will maybe send it to a subcommittee, and then they'll send it back to the committee for approval. So the committee kind of decides what the next step is going to be. All right, so after the committee, what do you think is going to happen? So we have the bill is reported, the bill is voted on, the bill is a law, the bill is sent to the president, it is debated, or it is referred to the Senate. So notice that the bill is reported talks about the House of Representatives, so that's our next step. So committee approves the bill and it's reported to the House floor. The bill is then debated by the U.S. representatives on the House floor. So they have to debate it, they talk about it, all that stuff. And so, the bill is then debated on the House floor, so that leads us to this one. The bill is debated. So representatives talk about it. They say, I agree with it for this reason. I disagree with it for this reason. They talk about any issues that they might have it. They talk about maybe revisions or changes, and then they decide to vote on it. And so that leads us to the bill is voted on. So there's 3 methods for voting on a bill. So they can either say like, yes, I agree with it, or no, I don't. You can like stand up and they vote on it that way, or they just record it. So you say yes or no, or you can even say you don't want to vote for it. And so after the bill is voted on, so that is only half of it. That only happens in one part of Congress. So after the bill is voted on, it gets sent to the Senate. And so when the bill goes to the Senate, the senators vote on it. They're like, yes, I'm for this. No, I'm not for this. So if most of them say yes, say that they support it, then it goes to the president. And so if the president agrees with the law, they can just sign off on it. Or the president can veto it. If they don't like a bill, they veto it, and then it can go back. But Congress can override a veto. If they have enough votes, if they have 2/3 of the votes of the people in Congress, they can override the president's veto. Or sometimes the president can do nothing. So if Congress is in session, the bill automatically becomes the law after 10 days. If they're not in session, the bill does not become a law. And so if the bill does get passed, if it's passed by the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the president didn't veto it, then it becomes a law, and then it is enforced by the government. So that was just an example of sequence, like putting things in order when it comes to the United States government. But let's also think about some vocabulary as well. So I'm going to read a sentence and pause the video and just think about which of these words might fill in the blank the best. Determining whether the federal government acts according to the Constitution is the main job of the what? So determining whether they act according to the Constitution is the main job of who? The judicial branch. So they decide whether something is constitutional or not. A blank does not usually become a law until the president signs it. So if it hasn't become a law yet, what's it called? A bill, right? The blank includes many departments that help enforce laws. The executive branch. Sorry I didn't write branch there, but yeah, the executive branch. So remember, there's the president and there's all the different cabinets of the president that help enforce the laws. The writers of the Constitution used the idea of blank by creating 3 branches of government to run the United States. So the writers of the Constitution used the idea of blank by creating 3 branches of government to run the United States. That would be separation of powers. So they didn't want one to be more powerful, so they separated it. They gave them different jobs. And then the Constitution gave the blank control over government spending. So who is in charge of government spending? The legislative branch. So they write bills that say, hey, money will go to this, money won't go to this, and so on. And then the idea that each branch of government has a certain amount of power over the other branches is called checks and balances. So they keep each other in check. They make sure one isn't more powerful than the other one. So that is it for this video. I hope that this maybe helped answer some questions about government, maybe some information you might run into on the social studies test. So be sure to like our Facebook page. Do the self-check on this in the Google Classroom to just see what you understood. And yeah, good luck. I hope that this helps you on your social studies material. All right, have a great day.